Hey guys, so I wanted to start our lesson on the 13 colonies with a book. And it's a kind of gross book, but it's one of my favorites. It's called The Dreadful Smelly Colonies. I think you're going to like it. So we'll jump right in. It says the disgusting details about life in colonial America. So it's going to be interesting. Let's see. All right. New land, new home. In the 1600s, colonists came to America from Europe with the hopes of freedom and a new beginning. What they found instead was rough land, harsh weather, and dreadful living conditions. When colonists arrived in America, no warm, cozy homes were waiting for them, so they needed to find shelter fast. In the southern colonies, the first colonists lived in tents made of sailcloth. They complained bitterly of the bugs. Mosquitoes feasted on the new arrivals. Other colonists built small wigwams. They tied poles together and covered them with bark and tree branches to keep out the winter's cold. A fire added light, heat, and blinding smoke. In winter, families huddled on the straw floor beneath furs and blankets. So here you can see them first arriving. And up here, it's called a foul fact. So something foul is something really gross. So the foul fact here is, in 1610, 175 new settlers arrived at Jamestown, Virginia. They found only 60 of the first 500 colonists alive. Disease and starvation had killed the rest. That's a lot of people that died. Some settlers in Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania dug cave-like homes. So they dug caves in the ground. They lined dirt walls with sticks to prevent the home from collapsing. One wall contained a small door. Bugs skittered in through the tree branch roof and dropped onto sleepers. Mice, rats, and snakes slithered through the sod. So they would be sleeping and all those animals would go all over them. The first wooden houses were only about 20 feet wide by 20 feet long. Shutters over the windows kept out the wind, but they also kept out the light. A fire burned constantly to provide light and heat. Everyone ate, worked, and slept in just one room. A lucky family might have a table and one or two chairs. Children stood while they ate their meals. They slept on the floor on mattresses stuffed with rugs, corn husks, or bits of leftover wool. Houses smelled of smoke, stew, and sweaty bodies because they were all hot and close together, and they didn't bathe as much as we do, and they didn't have deodorant or anything like that. So you can see here are some colonists and their animals. And this is a journal entry from Thomas Prince. It says, Disease and Death, March 24th, 1621, Plymouth Colony. This month, 13 of our number died. During the last 3 months, half of those in our colony have perished. That means they didn't survive. Most died from lack of housing. Some suffered from diseases like scurvy, brought on by the long ocean voyage. Of 100 persons, scarcely 50 remain. The living are barely able to bury the dead. There's no one to care for the ill. But spring is coming, and we hope that the deaths will cease, and that the sick and lame will recover. All have shown great patience during this time of suffering. That's really sad. A lot of people didn't make it. All right, this next section is called Hardtack Anyone? So I want you to listen to try to hear what hardtack is, okay? Picky eaters didn't last long in the colonies. At first, colonists ate what they brought back with them on the ship. They ate dried peas that had to be soaked in water for hours and then boiled. When meat became moldy and rotten, colonists scraped away the mold and ate what was left. So they ate it anyway, even though it was moldy and rotten. Their only bread was hardtack. There's that word. A rock-hard cracker made of flour and water. Beetles called weevils burrowed into the hardtack, which made it easier to eat. So this right here, this is hardtack, and there are a bunch of little holes in it. It was very hard to chew until the beetles would leave the holes and it made it softer. That's kind of gross. After these supplies ran out, most colonists suffered through a starving time. Some settlers survived on corn that they bought from American Indians. Others tried fishing. The forests were full of wildlife, but most colonists didn't own guns, so they ate whatever they could gather or kill. One Jamestown colonist reported eating, this is really gross, but they had to, they were starving, dogs, cats, rattlesnakes, rats, toadstools, horse hides, and whatnot. Ooh. He was lucky. Many others did not survive. In time, colonists learned to grow corn, but corn made for a boring diet. In many homes, colonists ate cornmeal mush and porridge for both breakfast and supper. The biggest meal was often a stew of beans and corn and other vegetables. On a good day, the stew might include raccoon or deer meat. Yum! Now, this next section is called No Privacy in the Privy. A privy was a bathroom, but their bathrooms weren't inside like ours are. They were outside, and they called them an outhouse or a privy. Ooh. Imagine the nice, comfy bathroom you use every day. Now, picture a rough tree, a dirty pit, or a smelly outhouse. Pretty gross, right? But that's what the colonists used for bathrooms. At first, colonists stepped behind a tree or a bush when they needed to go. But as towns grew and people lived closer together, they needed a solution. Colonists dug pits downhill from their home and built outhouses or privies over the pit. A board with a hole in the middle formed the seat. Waste fell into the pit. When the pit was full, colonists dug a new pit and moved the outhouse. So this is what the outhouse would look like. They would have this as the seat, a board, and a hole. And then underneath the outhouse, they would dig a big pit. And so when they went to the bathroom, it all fell in the pit. And when there was too much in the pit, they would bury it, dig a new hole, and move the outhouse on top of it. So that was kind of a little bit yucky. People who were very old or sick used a chamber pot. So let's talk about what a chamber pot is. When people were too old or sick to get out of bed, they couldn't travel outside to the outhouse. So they would have a bowl underneath the bed that they would take out and use the bathroom in. And then they'd put it back. And when it was full, they would dump it out. All right? Now, this was often children's jobs to empty the chamber pot. In cities, chamber pots were emptied into the streets, sometimes landing on people's heads when they passed by. So imagine walking down the street and somebody dumping that on your head. That's pretty yucky. Animals added to the problem too. Pigs, cows, and horses wandered freely through the towns, leaving their droppings behind. Colonists didn't watch their steps. They'd carry the stinky mess inside on their shoes. Ugh. Here's another one of those foul facts. There was no toilet paper in colonial America. Colonists used corn cobs to clean themselves. They tossed them in the pit after use. A corn cob, when you eat corn on the cob and all the corn's gone, the corn cob is what's left. So that's what they used as their toilet paper. That would be kind of yucky. All right, here's a picture. Them working. And this says, dirty jobs. How would you like to bend over 6,000 times a day planting tiny seeds? Sound like fun? Maybe not to you, but that's how colonists planted their crops. But before colonists could plant seeds, they had to clear dense forests to make farm fields. Men swung heavy axes to cut down massive trees. Once the huge trees fell, they had to be cut apart and moved. There were no sawmills, so men chopped logs and firewood by hand. Once the trees were gone, the dirty field work continued. Men, women, and children used hoes and shovels to break up the hard soil. The dirty job got a little easier when plows were invented in the 1670s. After the fields were plowed, it was time to plant. But that just meant more long hours digging in the dirt. American Indians taught the colonists how to plant corn in small hills. Men and women planted corn crops by hand. They used a small stick or their finger to make holes in the dirt for corn seed. Colonial children worked alongside their parents harvesting crops. All right, the next section is called hard labor. Colonial farms needed workers, as did businesses such as lumber and shipbuilding. Indentured servants and slaves did much of the work. Indentured servants signed a contract promising to work for 4 to 7 years in exchange for a free trip to America. So, a slave was somebody that was basically kidnapped, sold, and forced to work for whomever bought them. An indentured servant was someone who said, if you will pay my way to America, I will work for you. And so they would work usually about 7 years, and then they would have their freedom. The difference between a slave and an indentured servant is a slave didn't have a choice, and they were usually not given their freedom. An indentured servant signed up for it. They chose that life and got their freedom later. In 1619, the first African slaves arrived at Jamestown. At first, a few people were able to buy their freedom. Later, the laws changed, making them slaves permanently. Slaves were considered the owner's property. Trying to escape meant death. Many slaves were beaten, whipped, and worked to death on the farms of colonial America. Indentured servants and slaves got up at dawn and worked until bedtime. Female servants hauled water, cooked meals, cared for children, and helped in the fields. Male servants cleared land, tended crops, and whatever their masters required. All right, so actually this picture that I showed you, this man right here, they're holding an auction to sell him. So he's been kidnapped, taken from his home, and now they're going to sell him like he's an object, even though he's a human. So it was a very, very bad time in our history. Young slave. This is written by a slave boy in Massachusetts in the 1740s. When I was 9, I was forced to work even harder. In summer, I pounded 4 bushels of ears of corn every night in a barrel for the chickens. In winter, I had to card wool until a very late hour. If I failed at these tasks, I would be harshly punished. So even the young slaves had to work and were treated just terrible. All right, rough roads. Rough roads. Getting around the colonies was a chore. The best way to travel was by boat, provided your craft didn't topple over into the churning waters. So that means traveling by boat was good unless your boat tipped over. Most colonists traveled by foot following old Indian trails through the woods. Trees and bushes barred the way. Travelers jumped or waded across narrow streams. They crossed deep rivers and streams in boats or canoes. Most people couldn't swim. Carriages and carts were rare. In 1697, Philadelphia had only 30 wheeled vehicles in the entire city. Small, cramped carriages bounced along rough dirt roads. Wheels fell off, horses got tired. A carriage trip was slow, dusty, and uncomfortable. Long trips took several days. In remote areas, travelers slept outdoors or stayed with farm families. In towns, they stopped at taverns. The tavern owner provided food, drink, and a shared bed for a price. All right, so it would be like if you went to a hotel for a place to stay and you paid, but instead of having your own room, you would have to share a bed with a bunch of other people. So that was kind of, I don't know. I don't think we would want to do that now. Foul fact. In taverns, travelers shared not only a room, but also a bed. In some taverns, 6 men shared one bed, and they slept head to toe. So if one person's head was here, the other person's head would be here. That way, they had more room. All right, witch trials. This was a crazy part of colonial history. Some colonists blame witches for bad weather, ill health, dead animals, or failed crops. Women, more often than men, were labeled witches and put on trial. If a woman was found guilty of being a witch, her punishment was often death. Ugh. Connecticut held more witch trials than any other colony. The most famous trials occurred in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. Several young girls accused dozens of townspeople of witchcraft. The accused were jailed for months. 19 of them were eventually put to death. One 80-year-old man refused to admit his guilt at a trial. He died when heavy stones were piled on top of his body. By 1700, the witch trials ended. Women were tried and convicted as witches, even though little evidence was presented against them. So this is a picture of a witch trial. She's the one that they're saying is a witch. And here's the judge. And they're trying to decide if she was innocent or guilty. And they would do this, they would accuse people and not really have proof. And then the ways that they decided if the person was guilty, it was crazy. Like, they would tie stones to someone and put them in water. And if they floated, they were a witch. But if they sunk, they were a human. Well, by that point, they had already drowned. So it was just, a lot of it didn't make sense at all. All right, bad medicine. Bad medicine. Almost from the time they landed in America, colonists battled new and deadly diseases. Smallpox, diphtheria, and yellow fever killed thousands. Smallpox attacked the American Indians and colonists alike. After 3 or 4 days of fever, blisters broke out all over their bodies. Skin fell away, and the victims died in terrible pain. Diphtheria was a deadly lung disease. Yellow fever spread by mosquitoes caused high fever and death. Doctors tried bleeding patients to cure these and other illnesses. A doctor made tiny cuts in the patient's arm until their blood ran freely. Doctors also gave foul-tasting medicines that caused vomiting or diarrhea. Doctors believed that blood, vomit, and diarrhea carried illnesses away. Now we know that that's not true. For fever, colonial doctors cut fish called herrings down the back and tied them to their patients' feet. Other doctors gave patients a broth of boiled toads. People believed that the stronger the smell, the better the medicine. So the nastier it was, they thought the better it was. Over here, we have a picture of a colonial doctor gathering plants. And that would be to make the different medicines and cures. Uncommon cures. The women are pitifully tooth-shaken, whether through the coldness of the climate or by the sweet meats, sugar, I'm not sure. For toothache, I have found the following medicine very available. So this is when women would have a toothache. Add butter to gunpowder and rub the jaw with it. For frozen limbs, make a lotion of soap, salt, and molasses, or use cow dung boiled in milk. Cow dung is cow poop. And that was written by a doctor, John Jocelyn, in 1674. Okay, this says, what's that smell? Here is how colonists washed their clothes. They would put water down here and their soaps, and they would scrub them on this washboard. It wasn't just medicines that smelled bad. Colonial people did too. They seldom bathed. Most people believed water was unhealthy.